If you can't hear me, cup your ear, or make some indication that you can't hear me, all right? And I'll try to make it loud enough. We got to do 2 classes today, and I'm recording it. So recording it for prosperity will go on YouTube, and I tell people on Facebook when it comes out, and also if you go to my websites, you can find that. I didn't write it on the board. There's the websites that you can read the new novel, and also my main website, ldalpers.com. If you go to the educator section, you can find these shows, new shows. But in any case, let's see, this is working? Yes. You guys know about this stuff, the books, you got the books. We're talking about this time period, generally about 430 BC to the birth of Christ, about 5 BC, which is a very critical period in history. We've already been over this over and over and over again. How many times I got to go over it? I don't know. We'll keep going over it because this is a very important part of history, which is interesting that our documents were taken from us. 1826, as we know, they disappeared because of printing costs, and generally what we're talking about are those documents, those works that come in the intertestament periods, between the Old Testament and the New Testament periods. These are books by definition, by our definition. This is our definition. We developed it, defined it, the first class. These are the books that are included in the Septuagint and the Vulgate, but excluded from the Jewish, and since 1826 from some Protestant canons of the Old Testament. That's this intertestament Apocrypha. That's what we call the Apocrypha. And as you know, again, we've talked about the Greek rational world. The idea of Greek rational thought was founded in this time period. Alexander the Great conquered and Hellenized. The world was Hellenized. They were speaking Greek. That's why the Septuagint is so important, because it's the Greek translation of the Old Testament and the apocryphal documents. And so the Romans continue to spread this, and in this period, we'll learn next week because we'll study the Maccabeans, but in this period, Rome was in ascendancy as well as the Greeks. So, this is the Apocrypha, separated into the Greek Orthodox canon, the Protestant Apocrypha, including the King James, and the Roman Catholic and Lutheran Apocrypha. So take your pick. Think out which one you want. You know, if you're Catholic, you got this one, and Lutherans do the same. If you're Protestant, do the King James. If you're in the King James, you should ask, where's my Apocrypha? Because the King James had the Apocrypha in it longer than it didn't. And then, of course, the Greek Orthodox. They've always had these. Today, we're talking about Judith. Judith and the parts of Esther they took out of your Bible. These are really neat pieces parts, and Judith is one of my favorites. Tobit is my favorite of all the apocryphal works, but Judith is a close second. Judith, you know, we have the books, Esther, Ruth, and Judith. 3 books, 2 Old Testament that are usually accepted by everyone, Ruth and Esther, named after a woman. Now, if that doesn't seem interesting and odd, especially in these kind of cultures, I don't know what is. But Judith is one of those that was taken from us, but yet based on the name of a woman. Judith means Jewess in Greek. It may have been written in Hebrew, around 150 BC, and then soon translated in Greek because all the existing manuscripts we have are in Greek. There is evidence of Hellenization in the text. Now, it may have been written earlier because it's set in 587 BC. There are issues with the document. I'll talk about this. It's a narrative about a beautiful young widow named Judith who saves her city, Bethulia, in Israel from a military siege. Judith goes out into the enemy commander's camp. She allures him, gets him drunk, and then chops his head off. All while he's asleep in his tent. This, one of the neatest things is, you know, apocryphal art. There's a lot of art. You know, we only not had the apocryphal documents for about 200 years or less. Where, for what, 1,800 years almost, we had them. There is all kinds of artwork from the apocryphal period. Especially since, you know, here is a female heroine I mean, talk about a neat picture, and I do have the photos, right? If you noticed in the picture from the last, when I was telling you what we were going to study this week, that was like, what, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago? I had one of those, but it was kind of hidden because I'm using a Tobit motif of Tobit artwork in the back there.
I'm going to have to leave early too.
Oh, that's right. In any case, she returns with his head, shows it to her people, exhorts the men to go forth and rout the enemy, what they do. And so throughout this story, she's presented as a woman who is very keen to observe the laws of Moses. She's a good Jewess.
But one part of that law is thou shalt not kill.
No, thou shalt not murder.
Thou shalt not murder.
Thou shalt not murder. Yeah. That's worth another class, isn't it? But, you know, isn't it funny that we mistranslate that? But that's a Hebrew thing. In any case, this is connected with Jonah because there is a Nineveh connection in Judith. Remember in Tobit there was a Nineveh connection? Now why wouldn't the rabbis like Judith? Remember one of the reasons that the Jews lost the apocryphal documents was because the Council of Jamnia, whenever it happened, you know, about 90 AD or so, 190 AD if it occurred at all, but many scholars believe it did. We have Talmudic evidence. But in any case, when the Jewish scholars, the rabbis, decided which documents would be included in the Hebraic canon and which would not, one of the main reasons was because it was Greek or Hellenized or not. There are other reasons, and this is the reason. Number one, good happens to a Jew who is from Israel. From Israel. Daniel originated in Israel and was taken by force. So you can see why Daniel is positive, right? I've always wondered why Esther was in there. Because Esther was not taken by force from Israel, and she wasn't pining to go back to Israel. She was the queen, right, of Nebuchadnezzar, or one of the kings anyway. But in any case, good happens to a Jew who is from Israel and doesn't intend to go back. There are historical issues, perhaps not so much because of the Dirash and the worldview. And by the way, let me clarify this. Judith is in Israel, but there is a lot that's going on outside of Israel. And by the way, Judith is from Israel and not from Judea. So if you remember, after the Assyrian captivity, there was no, quote, Israel. So you see what I'm getting at here when I make that comment about good happens to a Jew who is from Israel, as opposed to from Judea or from, etc. There are historical issues. There's not so much because of the Dirash worldview. The Dirash worldview being that worldview of looking instead of at literal, but rather looking for an analytic or looking for a homiletic reason, or it's not good to say allegorical, but you know, a reason within the text instead of a literal view. There is a sensible woman. Judith is a very sensible woman. A woman is a hero. Not only that, a woman redeems all of Israel. Babylon wasn't the bad guys, it was Assyria. The reason for that is because, remember, this is written about, we believe it was written about 150 or so, let's say 150 to 100 BC. So, who's the bad guys? Well, Babylon's the bad guys, right? The Seleucid Empire, which is kind of the stand-in for Babylon at this time. So instead it's the Assyrians. More reasons they wouldn't like it. There's more about Nineveh in here. Remember, Jonah went to Nineveh, and Nineveh was in a positive light, and then Tobit came from Nineveh. But you know, nothing good can come from Nineveh, could it? A woman prays directly to God, and her prayers are heard. Now, last time we heard about that was in Samuel, remember? The woman was praying in the temple before God, actually before the tabernacle, and what did the priest say? Are you drunk? But God heard her. There is a conversion to Jewish thought, to Judaism. And this is really unusual. Because, does anyone remember a conversion to Judaism in the Old Testament? The last guys that converted to Judaism, remember the group that raped, I think it was, did they rape Tamar? Or really it wasn't rape. The guy took her as his wife, quite legally in their cultural system. And they said, well, you need to convert to being a Jew, right? And so they had all the men circumcised, and then while they were trying to recover, they went and killed them all. So, do you see there's a difference in thought here from Old Testament view of converting to Judaism to a different worldview? I think I mentioned it to you more than once, but remember, in the Old Testament period, it was kind of a live and let live, we kind of live beside you and with you kind of viewpoint. Where as we moved into this period, there was a view that we had made a mistake by doing that, and therefore the enforced Jewistic conversion. So we see in the Maccabean period the Jewishification of this part of the world, because basically they forced. That's why Herod's family, an Edomite, Herod became king, because his family, his father and his family, had been forced to convert to Judaism because of conquer. And so we see this conversion to Jewish thought or to Judaism in Judith. Now later on, after the Christian period, in the Christian period, we find the Judaism moving to another way of thought. So after about 125 AD and the final Jewish revolt against the Roman Empire, we find that the Jewish thought went into isolation. So no conversion at all, which is interesting. But in any case, a woman is pictured as wiser than the wisest man in all of Israel or Judea. And did I say there's a sensible woman who saved Israel? Ladies, don't you wish you had Judith back? Yeah, that's a neat book. There's issues with Judith. Judith has historical issues. Nebuchadnezzar was the king of the Babylonians from about 605 to 561, and not of the Assyrians, as asserted in Judith. His father destroyed Nineveh in 612 BC. The wall and dimensions of Ecbatana, remember Ecbatana? What do we hear about that city? That was in Tobit, right? Tobit are exaggerated, and there is some impossible geography. The return of Israel was under Persia many years later, not under Assyria. So, there's historical issues. Do I have another chart on this? Yeah. There are problems and issues with other Old Testament documents, but generally, we work many of them out. Plus, when we can't, we tend to ignore the issues, which, with Judith, there ain't so many fixes. And let me talk about that a little bit. It's very obvious that Judith was intended to be viewed as Dirash and not Peshat. Remember, Peshat is literal, where Dirash is a homiletic view. So, when I write a piece of literature, especially a piece of Greek literature in this period, very common in Greek Hellenized literature, if I want to tell you that I'm writing fiction, what do? I put in, what's that?
An inaccuracy.
I put in intentional inaccuracies. That is absolutely correct. In this period, especially, what you find, and you find this in a lot of Greek literature, if I'm intending to write you fiction, I tell you fiction. Now, how do you know that these inaccuracies are inaccurate? They're obvious. They're information that anyone would know. It's kind of like, for example, if I wanted to do this in a piece of modern American literature, I would start my writing by saying, Abraham Lincoln was the founder of the U.S., the first president of the United States. And you would immediately say, no, he wasn't. But if you understood the way the literature was written in this time, you'd say, what would you say? Ah, this is fiction. You see? This is a Dirash worldview, not a